Yeah, let's get going. So welcome to another SGA meetup on the topic of advertising without the emissions, lessons for digital advertising, free to play, and user acquisition. So a sort of broad remit, but we'll get into some of the details of what exactly we're going to be talking about in a minute. For anyone who's joining us for the first time, or if you're watching the recording later, and if this is maybe your first time, my name is Dr. Ben Abraham. I'm the Research and Standard Lead at the Sustainable Games Alliance. I've been researching the climate impact of games and the games industry since around about 2015, and I'm a co-founder of the SGA with my colleague Maria and Yuri Kupainen and our board as well. The SGA itself is a global non-profit member-owned cooperative run by and for the games industry. We're backed by some industry heavy hitters like David Helgeson, founder of Unity, and a number of other big names. SGA members include local games associations, mobile developers, PC developers, console developers, and founding members include Cybo, Starbreeze, Sports Interactive, and many, many others. We produce and maintain an open source standard for the games industry to measure and reduce its emissions, informed by the real game dev experience of our members and scientific best practices. The goal of the SGA standard is to enable efficient measurement and reduction of greenhouse gases, and not just for individual studios, but across the entire industry, embedding best practices and game industry specific processes and templates into that standard. We also have a network of sustainability professionals and sustainability-minded game developers to disseminate knowledge and simplify reporting and compliance, and ultimately just to accelerate the work that we're all interested in doing, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Digital advertising is an essential part of the games industry, from being a major channel to connecting with and acquiring new players for, the latest and greatest, biggest new games, to being a revenue stream for free-to-play games, to a whole bunch more. Until now, the main way that we've measured the impact of digital advertising has been spend-based, relying on estimates that draw from dollar values. So we don't really get a lot of control over that other than, say, spend less money, which maybe doesn't really work. The levers, it leaves us without very much control and no transparency over the overall process. So today we're going to hear from two speakers who share a passion for sustainability, coming from completely different fields, but who each have their own unique knowledge and expertise on how to address parts of this challenge. So we're going to first hear from Andrea Carrera, Senior Manager of Sustainability Reporting at Ubisoft, who's going to talk about the scale of the challenge and how their team have approached measuring and reducing emissions so far, and what we need to actually enable that in a better way. And then we're going to hand over to Anthony Falco, Global Media Sustainability Director at ad&eveDDB, which is the advertising world's version of the SGA. ANZ counts Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, and many more as members. And Anthony has spent, I think it's over 2 decades in advertising as the former chief production officer at the creative agency adam&eveDDB. So yeah, quite a wealth of experience here. Anthony's going to give us an introduction to ad&eveDDB's global media sustainability framework, which I'm a massive, massive fan of, which outlines the processes that produce the emissions through the entire life cycle of producing, distributing, and consuming digital advertising. So describing the whole life cycle. And yeah, it provides much needed guidance on how to measure those emissions that goes well beyond just adding up how much we're spending. It actually gives us some control over things like servers that we're using, where they're based in the world, all that sort of stuff. I'll leave the sort of details up to Anthony. So with that preamble out of the way, I'm going to hand over to Andrea and invite him to tell us a bit about Ubisoft's approach to the topic.
Yes, thanks, Ben. As Ben was saying, the idea is to give you a bit of an insight of why digital marketing carbon calculation is important for us as a global video game publisher and developer, and how we try to tackle this topic in the last 2 years. First of all, to give you the scale of the impact for us, I try to show you here the percentage of emission that relate to digital marketing on our carbon footprint for last fiscal year. So it's not astonishing that the majority of our emission comes from scope 3. We are a software company, so everything is digitalized and falls under that particular scope. And we can see that digital marketing emissions are quite high compared to the rest. They fall under the scope of purchase for us, and they account for more or less 16% of our total emission. So this is one of the major area where we are trying to tackle the issue, because we need to find a way to actually reduce as much as possible those emissions without just saying we have to cut spend on those services. So where are we today? At the moment, we are currently calculating CO2 emission on digital marketing on a monetary proxy base. So we take the total spend on marketing services, we apply a monetary conversion factor that comes from the French Agency for Ecological Transition, and we have our CO2 emission. Really easy to make, but not at all useful for having a long-term view and reduction projects or concerning these kind of emissions. First of all, one of the big problems is that we have a lot of uncertainty of data. We don't know where the monetary factor ends. We don't know which part of the life cycle are taken into account. We believe that it's only production and not distribution. So there is a lot we can do to improve on those sides. The second one is that we don't have visibility on the sources of emission. We don't know if the major sources comes from the weight of the advertising that we push on the internet. We don't know if it is the channel that we use, YouTube, Facebook, or others. And so we don't have, at the end, any kind of operational possibility to push project, to push target toward reduction on the long term. Given that this is a challenge, we are not just sitting there and saying, okay, it's a problem where we can do nothing. With my team, we try to do a first attempt to develop an internal model to calculate in a more operational way carbon emissions from digital marketing. So the first thing we did was try to understand what are the methodologies already on the market. So we did a benchmark and we looked at everything that is on the market. For example, at net zero, Anthony, you will see after, scope 3, SRE, EcoProd Carbon Cap, and many others that are some methodology on advertising emission calculation. The second one, we try to do an life cycle analysis of a campaign. So trying to understand which are the major part of a campaign that have an impact on carbon emission, trying to identify the main information and data that we have together in order to create after a in-house methodology to calculate those emissions. After that, we created an internal carbon calculator, which was an Excel-based tool that was considering different parameters such as format, duration of the advertising, content size, distribution of country of distribution, and many others. And we managed to actually have a calculation of carbon emission for one specific advertising campaign launched during the last fiscal year. So just to give you a bit of feedback on this first approach, it was a kind of a good proof of concept. We had a kind of a success telling us that we need to investigate more on this topic and to push more our research into this, because we were seeing emission that doubles up compared to what we have now. So we have a lot of gap that we have to combat. But we have a lot of negative downside with a methodology, with any in-house methodology. The first one is that we don't have an external benchmark to validate our result. We don't know if our result is actually correct. We don't have anyone which we can compare to in order to say, okay, we are not miles away from the reality. The second one is that it's really complex to scale up across all Ubisoft campaigns. First of all, because we do many during the years. So the amount of data that we have to process through an Excel-based tool is really high. And the second one is that we have a kind of a decentralized way of managing those campaigns. So it's hard to go and collect all the data from all the teams. This is something really hard. And the third one, really important for us, is that if we want to use this kind of methodology inside our reporting, we need to be able to audit this by a third party. And the state of the art that we have is not possible to audit them in terms of availability of sources, quality of the data, and so on. So for now, what we did was just a proof of concept, and we now have to explore more on this direction. And this is why we are here today, to share with you our experience and to start a bit of the talk, is that because we want to foster an industry-wide discussion and collaboration on the topic, to try and develop an industry-wide methodology that everyone can apply. My dream is to work on an open source model, because it can be profitable not only for a big company like Ubisoft, but for all the different studios out there that are trying to tackle the challenge of carbon emission calculation, so something that everyone can apply. And also to define some standardized emission conversion factor to cover data gaps. We know that when we did our first effort to calculate carbon footprint on digital marketing, we sometimes have some gaps on the data that we have and that we can get from suppliers or internal teams. So having some carbon factor that are recognized and standardized for all the industry will help a lot to actually have a good calculation. And in the end, is the fact that if we have a methodology that is shared toward the industry, there will be many more players that can actually put in place activities to reduce the carbon emission linked to digital marketing. And we can have something that for the European market is really important, methodologies that can be audited and applied in terms of regulation for non-financial reporting. And with this, I pass the word to Anthony.
I totally agree with everything you just said, Andrea. And one interesting fact for the group, Andrea, it's interesting to see that your marketing activities is 20% of your emissions. Just to give you some sort of context, within sort of other advertisers and the data that's been shared with AdNet, it can be as high as 35%, just so you know. Normally service-based businesses rather than manufacturing businesses, but even those manufacturing businesses can be double digits, can be over 10% of their overall emissions. So it is significant, and I think people are turning their attention to that. I'm going to show you some slides now, so let me just share my screen with you. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Can everybody see those slides?
Perfect.
Fantastic. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background just very quickly on AdNet. This is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot of detail here, and I'm going to try and skim over the top so we've got a lot of time for questions at the end. So if I miss anything, please ask some questions at the end if there's sort of any information you'd like explained further. Okay, so AdNet is a initiative for the advertising industry. It was set up in the UK and now it's become a global initiative to reduce the emissions from advertising. It's a 5-point action plan, and it goes from 1 to 5. 1 being future-proofing your business. How can you set targets, make commitments around, understand, I suppose, first your inventory, your GHG inventory, make targets, set targets, and make those public. So we encourage all of our supporters, and AdNet it survives on supporter contributions. How can we encourage those supporters to set those targets, near-term and net zero targets, and make them public? We then have actions around the operations. So action 2 is around production. Andrea mentioned Carbon Clap, which is a production-based tool. Reducing the emissions for production is around measurement once again, or calculation, and then a better understanding, and then making more informed decisions. We've developed a tool similar to Carbon Clap, or EcoProd, called AdGreen. Very similar tool. Action 3 is around reducing the emissions from media planning and buying, and that's the Global Media Sustainability Framework, which is what I'm going to talk to you about. Action 4 is reducing emissions through awards and from events. So if you're holding events as a company, again, be aware of the emissions associated to that event and what can you do to reduce those, manage those. But through awards, the industry loves awards, and how can we promote sustainability through those awards, more awards that have sustainability at the heart of the criteria, at the judging criteria. How do we educate the industry to make sure we're awarding, or maybe championing more than any other, the work that has sustainability at its heart, longer term. And we're working with Cannes Lions, we're working with a lot of the big award shows to work out a roadmap of how that can be embedded within the awards industry. And then action 5 is around the big one, really, I suppose, is as advertising, we have a superpower, which is obviously how we can change behaviors at scale. And so how do we do that to promote more sustainable behaviors, support more sustainable behaviors? And for that, we work with various other external organizations, but we also have our own award show with an industry trade magazine or a publication called Campaign. We have the Campaign AdNet Zero Awards, which has been sponsored over the last 3 years by Google. And it's a way of showcasing the best work across the world to the industry to try and encourage more to do the same, show the benefits and show the brilliance of some of that leading work. Okay, so the Global Media Sustainability Framework, we started a couple of years ago, and it's basically 6 frameworks across the 6 biggest advertising media channels by global spend. So that's print, audio, cinema, out of home, TV, and digital. It's built on climate science standards. We have a climate science expert group and industry best practice. We use the industry to develop proposals, and I mean the industry and specifically channel specific expertise. The estimates, it's designed to estimate media emissions more accurately across channels, geographies, and providers. People work with many, many different partners. Part of the problem is this inconsistency of measurement. So how can we do that more accurately, globally, across those channels? And we've created a consistent methodology that consistent boundaries for each channel to basically try and aid that. How can we increase transparency? Really important about the calculations, the methodology that's used, consistency and accuracy of those calculations, but also how can it be useful, practical, actually, in terms of, how can we implement this easily? And also it needs to evolve, because where we are now, we're going to evolve and learn more, and we need to keep building on it and improving it with greater accuracy, but also greater knowledge over time. And Ben, to your point, it's to foster an activity-based approach rather than a spend-based approach. And Andrea, you said the same, which is more often than not used at the moment. So why did we start this a couple of years ago? Well, within our group, and Ben, you mentioned the platforms, but we also have global advertisers, a lot of some of the biggest global advertisers in the world, actually, and they were seeing a massive variation in the calculation of the emissions measurement that was coming back to them, or estimation that was coming back to them. We were hearing that was up to a 6-fold difference from providers. So, you can't do much with that. If there's 6 times difference in your calculations, what is right and what can you use that for? On the other side, the media owners, who also are part of our community, they're going, well, we're getting lots and lots of data requests coming through, and we're not really sure what we're supposed to do with them. We're being asked for different data points. How are we being judged against our peers, against other channels? There was, I think, confusion, lack of trust maybe in the industry in terms of how that data was being used, and ultimately how accurate it could be if they were getting lots of different requests asking for lots of different things. And then we were also hearing, and Andrea, you mentioned it about reporting, big brands needing, or big advertisers, big companies having to ultimately report their emissions. And we needed to be mindful that we needed something that could be added into that reporting. We're hoping that obviously as part of that, advertisers can manage their emissions targets, which they're pretty much all set, and they're reporting better. Agencies can support those emissions considerations. And for media owners, there's clarity and consistency that at the moment doesn't exist. So I'll start at the beginning. We started by trying to create consistent boundaries for each of the channels. It's made up of 3 phases. This is consistent across each of the channels, even though the actual units of operation are obviously different. So in scope, under creation, we talk about the manipulation of maybe a creative asset, not the creation. Ad Green and EcoProd will look at the emissions associated to that, but the manipulation of that creative asset for a digital for digital distribution, the trafficking and any additional storage. Distribution is around the steps associated with media selection and ad placement, and then consumption is the direct energy consumed to receive the ad and the embodied emissions from the creation and disposal of the associated technology. Not all of it, but a portion of it. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So we created workflows. So with those phases in mind, we created workflows. These are two examples for out of home and for TV. So 3 phases, units of operation and sub-steps underneath. They are different, but they follow the same life cycle assessment, same boundaries of measurement, really importantly. And ultimately, then we created the framework, and it consists of 5 components. There's the channel emissions framework, which comes off of the workflow. There's the formula, the data request form, data hacks, and data sources. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about all of them now. But again, really top level, everybody. So if you want more detail, please ask me afterwards. So the channel emissions framework is basically that workflow diagram in more detail. It gives all the steps that are involved in delivering an ad campaign and identifies those key elements for consideration. So it looks like this. So this is one for publications, for print, but we start with the phases on the left, the sub-steps, the physical process involved, like paper production, transportation, printing. We then talk about the formula type, so what type of emission factors are needed to add to the calculation or be a part of that calculations. Are they embodied, operational factors? Then we talk about the scaling factors, so the other elements that need to be considered as part of the calculation, the number of ad formats, for example, weight of the paper, the printing process, and the distance traveled for the distribution of a physical paper or magazine, for example. We put what we think is the materiality. This will almost certainly be adjusted over time as we learn more. Andrea, you mentioned about, where are your hotspots in effect, or where should you focus your efforts? I think as more people use the framework and we understand more and further iterations are launched, this may be adjusted. In fact, the formulas may be adjusted, more broadly as we understand what should and shouldn't be included, or what maybe we can do to better the original or this initial formula or this initial framework. And then there's a formula at the end, which basically says how, what we're calling a conceptual formula, which is how you can, in effect, taking all of those parts, create a calculation for that step, that unit of operation. That's the remainder of it, just so you can see. And these all exist within our GMSF playbook and separately as extended frameworks with even more detail on our website. So then the formula is the mathematical expression of that. You saw it on the right-hand side. It basically groups together the parameters to be used in calculation. And it looks like this. You saw that on the left-hand side, but what we also give is greater notations around the technical parameters, more detail about the various components that go into each calculation, again, to help the industry. But again, this is at a conceptual level. So, practical implementation is another thing. And so what we've done, and we've just released in Cannes, is the data guidance for digital, really, really relevant for this group. And it's how we make the conceptual operational. And again, I'm not going to talk to you about this at the beginning of this call, at least. It's all on our website, so you can see how we've taken this conceptual thinking and created it into usable, practical use of the digital framework. So, and that's this part, which is data guidance. So data guidance is, what do we do if we haven't got data? How do we request consistent data from across the industry? And Andrea, you mentioned about data sources. How do we suggest data sources that can also create or reduce the variance in current calculations and give the industry the best available data sources for calculation? Also, it's telling the industry where they may be less or more reliable. Government sources, academic research, source, they're going to be more reliable than maybe an LCA that's been developed or created by an individual manufacturer, or even an industry estimate. So we'll over time categorize those by color, probably, to be able to give a sense of uncertainty or lack of accuracy, or less accurate, being less accurate, dependent on that source. So what does data guidance do, and what is it? Well, it's the bridge. So you've got the theoretical, but what it does, it addresses the data gaps that, again, Andrea was talking about. How do we create data guidance, data hacks, defaults that are consistent across the industry? There's massive inconsistency. There's people, obviously estimating based on their own knowledge or expertise. Everybody's doing it differently. It aligns that data collection that we've talked about and assumptions across stakeholders. So how do we bring the industry together to agree that this should be a standard way of approaching calculation when there is missing data? It allows emissions estimation at different levels. We're trying to build in different levels of granularity. So you have level 0 is we don't have any data. That's the industry default decided by the industry. Level 1 might be partial data down to maybe level 4, which is accurate data. So again, building in levels of data to understand the accuracy ultimately of the calculation. And then it basically takes away the barriers when we have incomplete data, enables more accurate calculation for reporting, but it maintains transparency and, I say, that uncertainty level. So we can say, if you've got pretty good data, it's going to be more accurate. If you've got less good data or no data, it's going to be approximations. And those approximations are going to probably be high. They're going to represent industry practices, but they're going to be pretty high, and they have to be high by design. Otherwise, there's no encouragement for anybody in the supply chain to disclose and maybe innovate to reduce those emissions. The data request form, I think we've talked a lot about that, but that's basically how we send out one common data request form based on a common methodology, a standard approach, which the GMSF hopefully gives the industry. And it asks certain questions. It identifies data owners. That's an important thing. We heard that back. Who's got that data? So on the data request form, it identifies this is going to go out from a media buyer. It goes out from a media agency, who has the data within the supply chain, what data hacks of the industry decide should be put in place if we don't have data, and what are the data sources that can be used for calculation, again, to reduce the variance and hopefully create consistency. Here's what the data request form looks like, a snapshot of it, which basically can be sent out and it obviously rebranded or however you want to do it if you have your own tool, but it should give the industry standard requests for data, which hopefully then we hope will encourage the industry to maybe start looking for that data, understanding how it's being used, and then having confidence on it being used correctly and consistently. Data hacks, again, it's the defaults. What do we do when we don't have data or the data is insufficient or unreliable? What do we put in place as a data hack to remove the barriers for estimation? But as we say, a hack will mean the accuracy will decrease because it's an industry approximation based on a current practice in the market. And I think you probably all know what emission factors are, but just to say that the GMSF is a cradle to grave LCA in effect for advertising campaigns. So all these emissions factors are needed as part of that calculation. So operational emissions factors, embodied emission factors for the physical items in the process, be it paper or devices, and then end of life for the disposal and of those physical items. We're only taking a proportion of that, though, of course, because it's based on how long an advertiser might be creating and displaying a piece of content on a particular device. And I thought I'd leave you before we enter into a bigger discussion later on with some of the things that we see as benefits and maybe some of the things you can do now as an industry. Andrea talked specifically about obviously using digital media channels to display advertising for Ubisoft. So if you're an advertiser like Ubisoft or anywhere in the advertising ecosystem, ask your partners how they're measuring their emissions on your behalf if you're using a calculator for media campaigns, and what methodology are they using? Because the GMSF helps to create consistent calculations across multiple partners. That's what we're trying to do. If the advertising industry decides voluntarily to use our formulas and frameworks, then, as I say, the variance in emissions calculation will go down. The accuracy, we hope, will go up. Everything we do is in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, so should be fit for reporting purposes. And if not, ask them how their approach might differ. And again, that's okay. That's okay. Some companies may use it as a benchmark against their own calculation, their own methodology. Some may reject our work completely. That's absolutely fine. But I think the GMSF gives the ability to understand a little bit more how those calculations are coming together. For advertisers and agencies, lots of advertisers, Andrea again mentioned about creating your own calculator. Some have gone further to create a fully functioning calculator that they intend to use and develop themselves. Consider aligning your tools with the GMSF framework for the reasons we've discussed. It helps. I think it helps to make GHG emissions a consideration in all media plans alongside more established metrics. So, how do you take sustainability as part of that? I think that's partly because, I hope it's because there's a greater sense of trust in those calculations. And so actually there's a greater encouragement to start building those into your own thinking and maybe assessing them against other metrics. And then media owners understand the data sources that are being used to create the calculation. So, if you haven't been involved in the development, and many media owners have, what are those data sources that you're going to be asked for? How can you start to be prepared for that? How do you understand, by understanding your emissions, the hotspots and your areas of focus? Because it gives clarity that maybe the industry hasn't had before, and hopefully consistency and transparency about how those requests are being made and how that's going to be used. I think that the important thing to finish on, everything we do is free to use. Nothing will be behind a paywall. Everything we do will be to hopefully be for the good of the industry, for the industry to adopt or not voluntarily. And all of our work is done with a huge part of the industry's contribution, again, channel by channel, but also some of the largest advertisers who oversee our work and are part of our steer team who steer the development of this work. I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that was useful.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Anthony, and Andrea as well. I have so many questions already. Maybe the easiest way to ask questions, if you've been listening and have some, is to put them in the chat, and we'll try and get to them as we go. But also, if you wanted to ask directly too, feel free to do that. I think you have the opportunity to raise your hand possibly, or make a reaction or something, and we'll call on you. But yeah, gosh, where do I start? Like, there's literally so many questions that I want to ask. And for those of you who know the SGA and what we do, I think you can immediately see just how in perfect alignment we are with the with so many of the approaches of the ad net zero approach and the GMSF. From like transparency to enabling fair and the same sorts of calculation approaches. The first thing that I wanted to really ask about, and this is actually not one of the questions that I had prepared earlier, but it's really around the sort of question of how you manage to develop the technical standards and manage different expectations or different approaches or different attitudes to what seems to be fair, or what should be included, what should be excluded. Could you talk a little bit about the politics of managing the technical exercise, the methodologies?
I can. In fact, I've actually, before you said that, is something I wanted to feed into this group actually. So importantly, we have a sort of process document. And again, I will point you all to our playbook on the adnetzero.com website, because you can see everything on there. You can see each channel. Obviously, this group, obviously more interested in digital. But again, you see all the digital guidance that has helped to make, we hope, the work operational. But to your point, Ben, what we have is a steer team at the center, brands and trade associations. So trade associations like IAB, but also lots of advertising agency and advertiser trade associations from the US, from the UK, from France. And so outside of that, we then have technical expertise. We have our client science expert group, and we have a formula writer who is our sort of key formula writer who's done a lot of this for a long while. And then we reach out to the channel. So this is the question I think you're asking, Ben, which we reach out when we're working on a specific channel like digital. We reach out for a partner or somebody to work with, to be able to bring the industry together, to convene around the problem and to contribute voluntarily their time and efforts and expertise to the process. And for digital, we work with IAB Europe. the IAB Europe represent the digital side of the industry, advertising industry. And pretty much everybody is a member of IAB Europe. So they helped us to convene that group. A lot of them are and Net Zero supporters. We know all of them, but convened in that forum seemed the most appropriate and the most effective. And so we had pretty much a lot of the calculator owners from across the industry. We had a lot of ad tech more broadly, SSP and DSP representation. Google and Meta were part of that as well. So we've had, good representation, weekly meetings for many months, actually, deciding on the best methodology, or not the methodology, because the methodology was also designed by all of them as well, but the best approach to guidance. And I think, Ben, to your point, I think broadly there's an understanding or an acceptance that one standard approach is essential. We heard Andrea at the beginning talk about the importance of that as well. And so I don't think there's anybody who's disputed that is the right way forward. And so when you enter into a group that have a shared ambition, believe in the work that we're doing, and believe actually that it can improve their business, they can start shifting their attention to reduction, innovation. Hopefully it will encourage more advertisers to start to measure, to estimate and calculate, because they understand, because it has more use, more value. It's more trusted. It can be used in reporting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It starts to stimulate the industry to do more, understand more, maybe use that calculation as part of maybe a longer term strategy. So there was very little, resistance to that, and that's fine. It's all voluntary. So if somebody doesn't want to contribute or be part of that group, that's okay. Of course, that's okay. We want as many hands on this as possible. We want the industry to go, we believe this is the right approach, because actually, if we believe it's the right approach, more people are going to adopt it. Rather than being a standard, could it become the standard? I don't know. I hope so. We'll have more trust in media owners, who ultimately are going to be the largest part of the industry to supply this data. So they'll go, well, we've created these defaults, we've created this, we've basically sanctioned or created the proposals. There's more trust and understanding on how those calculations and this consistency across channels. So we've had a huge amount of support, Ben. Honestly, I can't see any resistance other than, as I say, some people may or may not want to participate in what we're doing. But we've had really great participation. And again, if you, at the end of the playbook, you can see all of the companies that have been involved. And at the beginning of the data guidance, you can see all the digital companies or people that work within the digital ecosystem that have contributed as well. So that's probably the best way of seeing that. But it's been a very, very successful process, which we're going to repeat with other trade associations, global or international trade associations in other channels.
Fantastic. What a great result too. I mean, honestly, I just can't emphasize enough how useful the GMSF is already as it is, and the version 1.2 that just came out last week. I think adds even kind of more detail. Tommy in the chat asked, Tommy from Rovio, are the emissions factors that AdNet Zero uses available somewhere? I think they are. I think I saw a link in that version 1.2 document. They
are. Thank you, Tommy. Yes, they are. They will become more and more complete over time. And as I say, we'll color code them so anybody using them can get a sense of how accurate those emissions factors are. They're all free to use. One thing we've had come back to us is, well, actually, we want to use different ones. We can get more granular information from sources that we pay for. That's okay. These are suggestions. We all of this is a suggested approach to create consistency and shrink variance and create, greater accuracy. So, yes, they are. They will be built upon. There'll be commonality over channels, of course, specifically around sort of the more digital part, the data center part of it, and the distribution part, which is similar in many channels. But yes, there's a link. There's also, again, go to our website on the resources page. You then go into GMSF and it's got all of the individual documents in there, including the data sources. And last thing I'll say is they've all been approved by our climate science expert group, which involves academics, sustainability leads within brands, trade association sustainability leads, so a real mix of companies that are involved in that, organizations.
Fantastic. I want to come back to Andrea for a second. You mentioned in your talk that, I think it was just in passing, that you have a very distributed way of, because this goes to the sort of the implementation question of like how you actually put it into practice. What is the challenge for Ubisoft in that distributed ad buying environment. Yeah, could you just talk about how an ad placement gets made, or what teams are in control of it, or is it separated by geography, or yeah, what's the approach?
So in general terms, we have one main team in charge of buying all the publishing activities, which covers almost all the countries. So there for us, the implementation is not much having the data, but how we can actually process all the data that comes from this team, because quite a huge amount. However, talking with all the different teams, we discovered that sometimes the ads are bought directly by by local teams. Sometimes we pass by agencies. Sometimes we don't know. So it really depends on the situation, and therefore we have a big chunk of our data that comes from this centralized team, but then there is a lot of other teams that does their activity, and then so the idea is that we need to go and fetch all the different information that comes from all the different parts of the company. And the other part that is really difficult in terms of how we can actually operationalize everything is that all the template and the way the data is presented is not always the same. So we might have, and this is where I think the work of Anthony is really helpful for the data hack. Like we might have for the majority, I don't know, the size of our campaign, but not for, I don't know, 2 or 3 campaigns. So there we miss something that we need to calculate. So there is some data gap that we don't know now how to overcome. So this is, I would say, like data consistency and data availability and the quantity of data to process is the 3 major challenges that we face right now for the specific topic.
And I think, if I can just jump in, Ben, if you wouldn't mind, to add to that, Andrea, what the GMSF, so going back to the process with IAB Europe, the major part of that process was how do we fill those gaps, Andrea? You know, how do we do that in a consistent way based on expert knowledge? And that group was sort of 20 plus companies to go, what can we put in as an industry estimate from the digital advertising industry to go, this is what we think it should be as a default if you have no data. So I think that will change, Andrea, over time. I think as we hear the industry feedback to us on, you know, the use of those defaults, as better understanding grows, you know, we will refine those, and they might be looked at probably on a yearly basis to go, actually, the default now is a slightly different value because we understand more. And again, it has to keep evolving. We will start monitoring the use of the framework and trying to hear back from the industry what works well, what doesn't work well, what's material, what's not material. So we're trying to create the consistency. Obviously, with hacks or defaults, there's less accuracy, but I think we'll still refine those over time as we understand more.
Another question that I wanted to ask both of you, I think, is around the use of programmatic advertising in digital ads. So this is a term that I've sort of been vaguely aware of, but only really kind of read up on in the last couple of weeks. But I think that's where it's like ads being bought and sold in real time, right? So you're not even saying like, okay, place an order for XYZ, and then you go to another platform, and so the platform then hosts that, connects you with someone who's got space to host an ad, and then there's a whole kind of network of digital communication that gets activated on that. How important is that programmatic advertising across games and then across like the wider advertising industry?
Andrea, I'll leave that to you first.
I'm not really an expert on this kind of topic, but I know that programmatic advertising is like one of the major parts of our marketing activities. So we really rely on it, and we use a lot of it. But it is important because we can have some waste in terms of digital waste, because as you say, we purchase to push 100,000 views, but we are not sure that those views are actually going to be viewed by someone, or they just stay there on the server and do nothing. So there is also a question of optimization in terms of both cost and carbon emission. And that's something that I know the internal teams are working on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think for us, that's the broader advertising industry. That's a large focus of the industry. Ben, as you say, it's it's a demand side and a sell side sort of process where you basically put up your ad space on a website and lots of people bid, and you have people, intermediaries in the middle, SSPs and DSPs, who basically sell and buy your inventory. But for one impression, for one placement on a website, you could have hundreds, thousands of interactions across the internet. So, if you look at that from a sustainability perspective, it can be incredibly wasteful. It's a really complex process. There's reasons behind it. Again, we can go into another time, or maybe I can share with Ben. Ben, I might try and share a documentation that helps you actually understand that a bit more and share that out. But Andrea, as you say, there's a lot of waste in there, but also there's a lot of impressions that are sitting on websites, what we call MFAs, made for advertising websites, that are incredibly low in terms of effectiveness. And so what we talk about in the playbook, but more broadly, is look at the waste. Look at this. If you're going to target something that you can make specific and quick wins on, where's your waste? Where is your low or where there's no or very low performance? Where can you look to maybe reduce that and reduce your emissions? But yeah, the framework again helps you understand. There's something called ads.txt, which basically shows you can see the paths between all these various contributors. And there's definitely a move to sort of understand that more and clean up that part of the supply chain to reduce the emissions.
Fantastic. Question from Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Ben. To Anthony, probably. So you mentioned these sort of, I'm going to call that low-hanging fruit. So if you could just be more efficient, and you have a business case for that anyway, so let's do that. If we go a step beyond that, and you mentioned that the system is wasteful, that some of these things maybe could, or at least you imply, could be changed in some way. I would ask you to expand that a little bit for me. So if you would have the possibility to change something more about how systemically ads and advertisement is produced, sold, or marketed, or traded, what would that be? What would be like the more long-term next step of your organization working towards that, if you would manage to already collect the low-hanging fruits?
Yeah, I think for us as a trade association, we are there to provide tools for the industry. Certainly in terms of any recommendations, we stop short at that. We want to create visibility for the industry to make better choices or bring those into the decision-making choices. Programmatic is certainly something that the industry is looking at because it is historically quite is energy intensive and potentially wasteful. But again, the GMSF can help identify the true emissions associated to that, and then decisions can be made by an advertiser through maybe their measurement partner or a calculating partner to make different decisions. So there are, and I say MFA would be something I think universally we agree as an industry is something that should be tackled as waste. On other channels, it's about optimizing within channels. So it's certainly not saying to remove channels from a media plan, but it's certainly to encourage companies to disclose their data. And maybe over time, companies may be favored. Money may be moved from one one company to another, who have innovated more within their own infrastructure, for example, to be able to reduce their emissions further. And somebody who's not measuring, or calculating using defaults, that may actually show that they are potentially higher in terms of those emissions. So it's about optimizing within channels. It depends on the advertiser. It depends on all the other media metrics that Andrea will be thinking about and his company will be thinking about. I think what we'd like to see is sustainability being a consideration within that. And so actually, can you make some different or informed choices that might help you to reduce those emissions, optimizing within your media plan? I don't know if that answers the question, Patrick, but we're very, we're not in a position to be able to say, don't do this, do that. What we want to do is go, here's a consistent way of measuring or calculating, which will be more useful to the industry, which hopefully will stimulate more understanding, involvement, better reporting, and create different choices, encourage the supply chain to measure or calculate, understand their own emissions, and innovate to reduce those.
Yes, I mean, you're getting towards an answer, right? And I understand that it's not speaking to your customers or clients or constituents and telling them what to do, but I was wondering, because you seem to be sort of the spider in the web, I'm using a Swedish expression here, knowing this, having this information from the perspective of your clients, what could be infrastructural changes that they would like to see anyways? And I think you alluded to some of that, but that's, of course, that would be very interesting for me to know more.
Yeah, I mean, we don't hold and we won't hold any of the data. So, again, we won't be able to see, where maybe those emissions hotspots are, or how, companies or our advertisers are placing or performing. Deliberately, again, that's not our position. What we will try and do, though, is we'll use some of the leading leading advertisers to share showcases with us, in the same way our AdNet Zero was, to go, how are you doing it? What are you learning? Where are you making changes? MasterCard were on a panel with us in Cannes, one of our steer team. They've got some fantastic examples of how they're starting to build sustainability into their media buying decisions, the size of the files they distribute, the length of the ads that they make. Jay was talking about a Messi campaign, that they've done, a global Messi campaign, that would have been a large part of their emissions associated to advertising. This is all stuff he said on the panel, but because they've optimized the file, they've reduced the emissions associated to the file size and the delivery, it's made a massive impact on the emissions from last year. So they're definitely thinking about ways beyond just where it's placed, what is placed within a particular media channel.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, that was going to be one of my next questions, actually, was about like whether you could share some of the good stories of successes that have already kind of happened. And so, yeah, that's a really great example already.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of focus. So again, sorry, Ben, very quickly, I think there's what can you do to make differences quickly? Waste, however you categorize waste, but what is not being effective, what is not working media for you. And then file size seems to be another area that the industry is looking at. The length of the piece of content I'm making, the compression of that file size, obviously not affecting quality, and how that affects the emissions associated to the delivery. So they seem to be two areas that the industry more broadly are focusing to go, these are quick wins. These are things that could make significant differences, and become areas of focus.
And maybe just to kind of follow on from that, and maybe to sort of extend Patrick's idea a little bit. Obviously, it's in the name of your organization that net zero is the goal. Are there any challenges or really hard barriers you see to kind of a net zero future for this particular technology, right? Like, what are the things that aren't compatible with that future? Are there aspects of that?
I think you could take that out into any business, actually, and into our own personal lives. I think technology it will help and hinder us. Maybe AI initially, but maybe longer term will be a help, not a hindrance. We'll see. But I think there are. I think we're still at a need. I think we still need greater understanding. And Net Zero started in 2019. And if I'm honest, I would have hoped by now most companies would have understood the emissions associated to their own activities. It's got to start there. That's why it's action one of AdNet Zero. I think it's got to start with understanding. It's got to understand, you then understand your main emissions. You then have to potentially innovate or change and shape your business a little differently in terms of processes to aid reduction. So I think we've got a long way. We've obviously got a long way to go. But I'm hoping the sharing of data can help to give us greater sort of knowledge and understanding. So yeah, I think there's a lot of barriers, but I think the first barrier is not enough people understand the emissions associated to their business.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, looking at the games industry as a whole and the big picture of, I think it's a very similar story, right? I think there's big areas, digital advertising is one of them, where, yeah, our knowledge is still very, very much at the beginning. And the work that we're trying to do with the SGA standard is to help fill in those gaps, to help cover the entire value chain of games. So yeah, digital advertising is a really important part of it, but there's also so much more that, yeah, we're working on as well. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for your attendance, your attention, and please join me in thanking our fantastic speakers again for sharing their knowledge and, yeah, the great work that they're both kind of doing. Just as a last little kind of mention as well, The SGA has members from all over the world. If you want to be part of the SGA and be part of the group that is anticipating and shaping the regulatory landscape and actively reducing the emissions of games in digital advertising in games, outside of games, but also everything else too, from end user play to distribution to absolutely everything. Please get on board and join the SGA. We also are only supported by membership. And you can join just by sending an email. It's super, super simple, very, very affordable. Members work together to reduce the costs of this really, really important work.
Maria, Ben, we can work together in the coming months and years
Absolutely.
to make sure that there is that alignment across our broader industry, collective industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. We'll, let's wrap it up there, and we'll see you around online.
Everyone, nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Bye.